There we go. Microphone. Yay! All right. Well, welcome everybody. So glad to see such a great crowd this evening. And we are going to be recording. So if anybody misses anything or you'd like to watch this again, please check out our YouTube channel, TADL Not Just Books, for the live recording of this. So tonight I have the esteemed privilege of welcoming Stephanie Carpenter. And when Stephanie is not teaching as an associate professor of creative writing at Michigan Tech, she is penning fabulous novels like the one we're going to talk about tonight, Moral Treatment. So I've got my copy. And Moral Treatment is also the inaugural winner of the Summit Series Prize Award from Central Michigan University. Stephanie is a native of Traverse City, woohoo! And she earned her bachelor's degree in English from Williams College and her MFA in fiction from Syracuse University. She then went on to obtain her PhD in English with a creative writing emphasis from the University of Missouri. Please welcome Stephanie Carpenter.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you to everybody at the Traverse Area District Library for hosting the event. It's been a delight to work with everybody on this, pulling this together. And in case I forget to mention at the end of the program, my parents are hosting a reception at the filling station next door, the filling station microbrewery, which will happen immediately after the event. Is there kind of an echo, or does it sound okay from where you are? Sounds okay? All right. So please join us over there. There'll be some pizza and some fun, maybe more conversation about the hospital. Yes, so as Kelly mentioned, my novel, Moral Treatment, recently published by the Summit series at Central Michigan Press. It is set in 1889-90 at a fictional version of the Traverse City State Hospital, or as it was originally known, the Northern Michigan Asylum. And I came to this project out of a long fascination with that place. I'd explored the grounds as a kid and as a teenager. I'd visited the museum that the former groundskeeper Earl Steele briefly ran in one of the cottages on the property. And I'd heard fragmented stories about older relatives' experiences working at the state hospital. And so there's a couple pieces of photographic evidence of this. This is my grandmother, Iris Carpenter, Iris Jordan at the time, who graduated in 1933 from the nursing school at the Traverse City State Hospital and went on to be the head of nursing at Osteopathic Hospital. And then we think the guy with the purple arrow pointing at his head is my great uncle, Robert Carpenter, who was head herdsman on the dairy farm. There's a little controversy between members of my parents' generation about whether or not that is actually Uncle Bob, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it is. And he was indeed the head herdsman. In fact, he was head herdsman at the time that the herd was liquidated when the farm was closed in the 1950s. So when I decided to write about the hospital, which was my first attempt at historical fiction, I found myself most interested in its origin story. Like, why had such an enormous facility had been built in this relatively remote corner of Michigan in 1885, and what needs did it serve? So building 50, which is the center top diagram there on the slide, was built like Michigan's other 19th century state-run psychiatric hospitals according to what was known as the Kirkbride Plan. If you're any kind of history bug about the state hospital, you might already know that term. And that's not named after Thomas Story Kirkbride, who was the longtime superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in Philadelphia. His 1854 text on the construction, organization, and general arrangement of hospitals for the insane offers very detailed instructions for hospital management, which range from what to pay attendance to the proper ventilation of urinals and kind of everything in between. And that book also describes the sprawling linear structure that we see diagrammed here in three different actual hospitals, the diagrams of three different actual hospitals, and also sort of like the generic version that's published in his text. following his plan, doctors would live in apartments in the center of the building with the women's wards on one side and the men's on the other. And the farther you move from the center, and the higher you went in the wards, the more severe the patient's illnesses became. That's how they were housed. The Kirkbride plan was also a key component of the moral treatment, the system that gives my novel its title. And you'll hear more about that in a moment in the first little snippet that I read. But briefly, what it meant was replacing inhumane methods of care that had preceded it with compassionate care for people who are experiencing mental illnesses. As the emphasis on architecture that you see here suggests, orderliness and routine were very important elements of this treatment. And so these are just a couple of snippets of images from my research. My research was pretty extensive, but three very important things were touring the hospital before the renovations began, which that's circa probably like 2001. I've worked on this book for a really long time. Heidi Johnson's collection of photographs, which I think was published sometime around then, maybe 2002, was really influential. That's a beautiful collection of very dreamy black and white photographs. This one is called Nine Windows, and it's one that I had over my desk and still do. And then a lot of documents of the period really informed my research for this piece, including primarily a publication called the American Journal of Insanity, which was a trade publication for superintendents of hospitals like this. And that's where I really got a sense of what was going on in the field at the time that I was writing about. And my novel is very much a fictionalized version of this space. It's not called the Traverse City State Hospital or the Northern Michigan Asylum, but it's based pretty closely on that and then informed by these different vectors of research. And so one thing I began to wonder about as I delved into these secondary texts and primary sources like the Journal of Insanity was why a building like ours had been built in the era that it was. Because by 1885, when the Traverse City Hospital was built, the Kirkbride plan had begun to seem inefficient and unmanageable, unwieldy to a lot of people in the field, a lot of asylum superintendents. So it was being replaced by something called the Pavilion Plan, which was smaller, more home-like structures. And if you look at the Traverse City State Hospital, you'll see that as it expanded according to that model. And so I really wondered, when so much money and effort and energy had been expended in building a hospital here in Traverse City, why they hadn't gone with a paradigm that was a little bit more cutting edge than the Kirkbride plan. And that's really where the idea for my main character, the hospital superintendent, comes from. I translated the problem of the hospital always being a little bit behind the times into a character who is aging. He's reaching the end of his career as an asylum superintendent, and he's grappling with questions about why his methodologies don't work. To convey his deep identification with his work, I refer to him only as the doctor, primarily anyway, as the doctor throughout the novel. So I'm going to begin by reading just a little bit of an introduction to him in his voice. This novel goes back and forth between the voices of the superintendent and a female character. So here's a kind of rosy image of our hospital and two asylum superintendents who influenced my imagining of what this character would be like. That's Thomas Story Kirkbride on the top and James Decker Munson, the first superintendent of the Traverse City Hospital, on the bottom. Again, my doctor is a fictionalized character, but thinking about the lives of these men definitely did inform my thinking about him, my imagining of him. So this is from chapter 1, and this is the introduction to the doctor. The doctor is a man trained in the old system, the system of moral treatment. He has staked his career on the therapeutic power of a well-ordered environment, on pure food, adequate rest, wholesome influences, wholesome occupations. These will cure the disorders of the ordinary brain, those strains of mania or melancholia brought on by wear or shock. To the patients who will not be cured, who suffer from organic or degenerative diseases of the brain, dementia, epilepsy, alcoholism, hysteria, syphilis, senility, paranoia, delirium, his hospital offers a generous refuge. His hospital is a public institution, built in 1885 after Dr. Kirkbride's linear plan. At the center of the main building lie the administrative offices, the pharmacy, the kitchen, and the doctor's apartments. The men's and women's wards extend north and south in symmetrical stepped wings. Convalescent patients are housed nearest to center, then intermediate, and at the farthest removes, the most disturbed. The hospital is the largest institution in this part of the state. 5 years after its erection, it remains the most modern, with forced air ventilation, indoor toilets, a telephone system, electric lights. Stumbling upon its vast grounds, a stranger might think himself in an arboretum, or, approached from another angle, a dairy farm, an apple orchard, the kitchen garden of a small city. The stranger might mistake the hospital for a small city, built of clean yellow brick, thriving and self-contained. There are nearly 700 patients at the hospital, and the doctor knows every one of them by name. He can recite their histories, he corresponds with their loved ones, he is the superintendent of the hospital's affairs, and he is its final authority in every course of treatment. Even his wife is involved in his work. She pays visits to the wards, invites women upstairs for tea. Most of the female patients are in their middle age, her age. Many of them have been ill-treated. Domestic infelicity is a common exciting cause of their insanity, as is grief, care, and anxiety. There are many women with whom the doctor's wife cannot converse. They are Swedish or Finnish or Dutch. They are farmers' wives and farmers' widows. They shake with palsy. They cannot sit up for the pain of breathing. They were found delirious in a boarding house downtown. They were discovered waist deep in a lake. They see things, they hear things, they speak in tongues. So that's a little bit about the doctor. My other protagonist is a newly admitted 17-year-old woman named Amy Underwood. She's inspired by ambiguities I saw in 19th century diagnostic criteria, especially for illnesses that were primarily associated with women. And so according to the paradigms of the period, Amy suffers from what's called pubescent insanity, acute neurosis, intellectual derangement, delusions brought on by puberty. And this is a historic photo of one of the women's wards at the Traverse City Hospital, taken around 1890 to illustrate Amy's perspective. So I'm going to read just a little bit about Amy from the doctor's point of view, a paragraph, and then a little bit more in her voice from a bit later in the novel, where she's been in the hospital for about a day at the point that I'm going to be reading from. And for a little context for that bit, her stepmother, Rose, who she refers to, is also her cousin. And Miss Carter's school is a boarding school that her parents tried to send her to briefly and somewhat disastrously before committing her to the hospital, which was a last resort. So here's a bit about Amy in the doctor's voice. The girl, Amy, is 17. Her medical history includes the usual childhood diseases and the onset of menstruation at age 14, roughly coincident with her psychic troubles. Over the past 3 years, her behavior has become erratic, her attachments shallow. Indifferent toward her family, she is swayed by strangers and prone to running away. She is destructive at times and has grown, of late, increasingly careless of her person. The parents have chronicled, too, the hapless efforts of their family doctor: cups to the back of the neck, mustard casts, draughts of quinine with iron. Most recently, they tried a water cure, a relic, the doctor might himself say, damp quackery. But he spares them his censure as he sits opposite them, reviewing their 2 requisite certificates of insanity. The referring doctors cite pubescence as the probable aggravating cause of the girl's illness. They make note of delusions. And then in Amy's own voice. Amy walks back and forth, past all the doors standing open outward. Every day at Miss Carter's school, she had a letter. Every day, even when her stepmother could only manage a paragraph. Most of those letters were about meals and chores, but sometimes they told memories of the old times, when the 2 of them were younger, Amy and Rose, both cared for by Amy's grandmother. Amy was a baby then. Rose was 14, 15, not her stepmother yet. Amy's mother was dead, and her father was at the lumber yard, and only her stepmother can tell her about those days with her grandmother, who is dead now too. If there's no letter, does that mean that Rose has died? Amy walks to the sun porch, rattles its locked door, walks back. No one rocks in the hallway at this time of the day, though in some of the rooms, women are mopping or scrubbing the floors. No one speaks to Amy or tells her what to do. Some of the open bedrooms are very clean. She enters one of them. At first, she is not sure it is not her own, so alike are the furnishings. But there's a book lying on the table, and beside it, a hairbrush. She doesn't have anything with her here. She was left without anything. The dress she's wearing is not even hers. Brown calico, it's plainer than anything her stepmother would choose, and too large in the bodice. Before, when they sent her off, they sent along books and brushes. This time, her father told her to put on her coat, and that was all he told her before their train drew near this city. She sits down on the bed that's just like the one in her room. It is equally as hard, and the black blanket is just as rough and strange. Even so, she knows that this is someone else's blanket, someone else's bed, and on the table, someone else's book. She draws the book onto her lap and opens it. On the front page is written, "To Violet Minor on the occasion of her confirmation, St. Paul's Lutheran Church, 1872. This is the year Amy was born, the year her mother died. Under her fingers, the page begins to pull loose from its binding. It wrinkles in the middle, torn free at the top and bottom. She holds the page between her first finger and thumb until it comes entirely clean from the book. It is just the size of her apron pocket and thin and crisp, rustling faintly when she walks. To Violet. A note written to a flower, from Rose. Walking up and down the hallway, Amy heeds the soft crackle of paper in her pocket. Before she can decipher it, the gong rings for dinner, and the women all line up. Okay. So these two characters' stories interweave over the course of the novel, which covers about, I always say about a year, but really it's more like an academic year, which is probably telling given my line of work. So she's admitted in the fall of 1889, and she's released in the late spring, or the novel ends in the late spring of 1890. As Amy navigates the ward's social and power dynamics, she forms relationships with her ward mates, with the hospital attendants, and even with the doctor's wife. And meanwhile, the doctor is struggling to stay on top of the demands of this ever-expanding hospital that's, kind of constantly asking for more and more from him. And the moral treatment had a really low cure rate, which meant that hospitals like ours here in Traverse City and like hospitals of this sort across the country tended to get bigger and bigger and bigger. More people came in than left. They became overcrowded fairly quickly. They expanded. And the ideal that he mentions, that he describes in that initial passage I read of knowing everyone by name, of knowing all their case histories, of writing back and forth with their relatives, that was not sustainable as things got bigger. And so this is what my doctor is grappling with, the question of whether he could or should do more at the hospital, the shortcomings of the ideology that he's devoted his life to, the moral treatment. And he's also facing pushback from one of his younger doctors, Dr. Engstrom, who would far prefer to work at a research hospital. And so Engstrom is handsome, he's young, he's a favorite among the patients. Primarily he's seeing the male patients, but he also has friendships among the female patients, and he's a friend of the doctor's wife. But he is meanwhile also somewhat of a tyrant with the attendants, who he considers to be incompetent and frankly liabilities. So, and here's an image of the doctor's offices from the state hospital, our hospital, and of a key ring featured in Heidi Johnson's book, Angels in the Architecture. So I'm going to read a snippet from a scene mid-novel when the doctor, the primary doctor, the superintendent, having learned about some experiments that Dr. Engstrom conducted upon himself. Actually, this was not so strange back then, testing new drugs upon yourself. He's learned about some experiments that Dr. Engstrom conducted with a drug called synconia, and he lets himself into Engstrom's office after hours and goes through the younger doctor's papers looking for a draft of an article he's learned that Engstrom has written about this experiment and is planning to publish. The doctor is horrified that a physician under his supervision might be making these unethical experiments, and he's horrified also at himself for doing something like this, for violating Engstrom's privacy. But above all, he's affronted by what he sees as disrespect of his authority as superintendent. So I'm just going to read a short passage of his time in Dr. Engstrom's office, and this is, again, kind of from the middle of the book. Calm down. he tells himself when he reaches his office door, but his fingers fumble uncharacteristically through his keys, and the gleaming door plates of the other physicians' offices seem to wink at him in the low light. Those offices are dark, with West and Meyer retired to their apartments and the diligent Engstrom hundreds of miles away. Save for his own foolish stomping, the building's administrative center is quiet for the night, except for the occasional passing of the watchman. And, checking the watch clock at the end of the hall, the doctor finds that the guard passed 10 minutes earlier. It will be hours before this hall is patrolled again. The doctor is alone in the center of the building, standing outside his office, standing outside Engstrom's. He finds the right key, turns it in the lock, and he finds himself alone with the other man's papers. He has never taken such a measure, but neither has he ever heard of such impertinence as this Chinconia affair, and he will know all of it if he can. The doctor seats himself at his assistant's desk. Its drawers are secured, but there is no lock in this hospital that can't be opened with his key ring. Fingers steadied, he quickly finds the right fit. He thumbs through Engstrom's neat ward notes, his old lecture notes from Ann Arbor. The boy's anatomical drawings are impeccable, his handwriting elegant. He has done his work well, it's clear, and the doctor is sorry for what he's doing. Engstrom's correspondences, Engstrom's expense ledger, no signs that the assistant physician has been compiling a paper. No clues at all, until the doctor has shut and locked the desk drawers again. He taps his fingers on the desktop, and there it is, in a folio tucked halfway beneath the ink blotter. Effects of Chinconia, C.F. Engstrom, hidden in plain sight, like Poe's purloined letter. Did the boy anticipate this search? The paper is as West has described it, detailing Engstrom's reactions after ingesting 20 grams of the tasteless stuff. He does not describe how he arrived at such an idea or how he found time to recover from a drug whose nearly paralyzing effects, according to the paper, often last for 10 hours. Paresis of visual accommodation progresses to almost complete blindness by the end of the second hour. The doctor shakes his head. If Engstrom had begun such a trial at 7 in the evening, he would only just have recovered in time for breakfast and morning rounds. How many times could he have repeated such an experiment? A sense of heat and bloodfulness in the head and upper part of the body is typically accompanied by muscular weakness and waves of nausea. Typically. The doctor feels some of these symptoms come over him now, his stomach shifting. Supposing Engstrom were to deliver a similar dose to one of the male patients, or one of the female. If the drug debilitated an able-bodied man, a sane man, what might it do to one of the patients? It's a consolation that Engstrom hasn't experimented yet on anyone else, or hasn't done so with West's knowledge anyway. But the doctor is a scientist too. The doctor appreciates that these results must cry out to Engstrom for further development or implementation. Having made the trial, surely Engstrom is anxious to take it further. The only way to really test its efficacy is to test it on other people, on patients. The doctor closes the folio. He slides it back beneath the blotter, and then he sees something else. A scrap of paper tucked under the blotter's edge, a scrawl of names. A. Underwood, L. Olson. The 2 girls on Ward 15, cases of melancholia brought on by pubescence, and a periodical mania with delusions of persecution. The doctor examines this enigmatic scrap, written in pencil on what might be the flap of an envelope. What business could Engstrom have with female patients? Does he have questions about these cases, an idea for another insubordinate experiment? Or is it, but how could it be, a personal interest? What does the boy think about afternoons in this office, seated here as the doctor is, in his rich leather chair, richer by far than the hospital's standard issue, adjacent to, but not communicating with the doctor's own office? The doctor crumples the scrap in his breast pocket. The hospital is and must be a well-ordered community. If Engstrom is to stay, he will focus on his attentions on his assigned duties. And so lastly, I'm going to read a bit from Amy's point of view, because this doctor, Dr. Engstrom, is somewhat of a source of vexation for her too. Her closest friend, Letitia Olson, believes that Engstrom will cure Letitia's headaches and possibly take her away from the hospital, whether as an assistant in his medical practice or even out of romantic interest. Letitia has a lot of sort of fancies about Dr. Engstrom. Letitia's just a few years older than Amy, but she's been in other hospitals before this one, and she's been subjected to some pretty harsh physical treatments, including force feeding. You'll hear references in this passage to the state of her teeth, which is that were damaged in that process. And Letitia's accusations against the doctor, the superintendent, reflect the traumas of her past. And Amy struggles to understand what her friend needs from her, what she can do for Letitia. So in the scene I'll read and end with, Amy and Letitia are seeing each other again for the first time after they had a physical fight about a month earlier. In punishment, Letitia, who is a ward of the state, not a private patient like Amy, was sent to one of the worst wards, one of the lower wards. And so the young women are reuniting at the hospital's Valentine's Day dance, which is a mixer for patients, staff, and even the hospital's board of trustees. This is something I thought was really fascinating in my research, these kinds of events. And so this is an image of the chapel at the Traverse City Hospital, of a Victorian Valentine, and of a dance that is not a dance at a hospital, but was period appropriate. It's from 1890. It's a naval ball or something, but I thought, just kind of set the scene. I would use that. So another character that you'll hear reference to in the scene I'm about to read is an attendant named Lil, who is kind of a friend to both Amy and Letitia, and so she comes up a couple times. So this is a little bit of a longer passage, and this is where I'll end for tonight. On Saturday, St. Valentine's Day, the chapel is hung in red and white crepe paper. The pews are again pushed back, the chairs arranged in ranks along the walls. Again, tubs of punch on long tables, platters of frosted cookies. Again, a band of fiddlers tuning on the stage. Amy's ward spent the whole afternoon making notes for one another, copying out inscriptions from Lil's old autograph album, a relic, Lil called it, turning the pages and shaking her head. She'd help them choose between rhymed variations on Forget-Me-Not. If the passing years us should part, hold my friendship in your heart. Now, in the crowded chapel, Letitia's laugh rises above the others, and Amy pushes her way toward that sound. Surrounded by strangers, Letitia stands laughing in her old calico dress. Amy touches Letitia's shoulder, and Letitia twines an arm around Amy's waist, drawing her into the circle. The other women, Letitia's new ward mates, seem hard used. One bears a diagonal scar from cheekbone to jaw. Another has a milky white eye. The third is missing the last 3 fingers of her right hand. All of them stare at Amy, looking over her dress, her boots, her short hair. They shingled her good, didn't they? Asks the scarred woman. It suits her. Letitia touches the ends of Amy's ragged bob. At least she's rid of her lice. This is for you. Amy presses into Letitia's hand a valentine cut from fashion plates and colored paper. She'd printed carefully. Dearest friend, forget me never, even if the sun should set forever. Of all Lil's inscriptions, this had sounded the most like Letitia. Now, with these women watching, she isn't sure. What's it say, Letty? Asks the woman with the milky eye. Why don't you read it to us? The others laugh, but Letitia ignores them. Thank you. She kisses Amy on the cheek and tucks the note between the buttons of her bodice. Just then, the fiddlers strike up a waltz, and Letitia's foot begins to tap. She grips Amy again by the waist, seizes her right hand. Dance with me until he asks, she urges. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Move, can't you? I'm sorry. But the strange women stare after them, still laughing, and Amy's heart clamors in her chest. If the old doctor could hear it now. Do you think I'm really angry? Letitia spins them. Nothing makes me angry on a dance night. It's almost worth the rest of it. Amy shudders. Is it very bad where you are now? It's worse than Ward 15, that's sure. Noisy all the time and women throwing fits right and left. But I'm gone most of the day, and by now I can tell which ones to stay clear of. Letitia turns them quickly, avoiding the edge of the stage. Those back there are all right, once you get to know them. I'm sorry, says Amy. She's dizzy already. I'm sorry. You ain't the only one to blame, but you could make it up to me. Letitia leans toward her. Engstrom said he would post a letter for us. Amy shakes her head. They won't let us. Didn't I just say Engstrom would help? You can write a letter, a thank you note to your parents for that Christmas box. Add to it that you're better and ready to come home. A thank you? Amy repeats. They treated you shabby, sure, bringing you here, when anybody can see there's nothing wrong with you. But thank you. They'll like to hear it, and maybe it wouldn't hurt either to say you're sorry. Amy lets go of Letitia's shoulder. The dance parts around them. I can't. Sure you can. Letitia presses Amy's hand back into place. Your stepmother said she was sorry. Now you say it back. I'll make up what else to say. They sent you that nice paper. They must want to hear from you. Write to your own family. Letitia rolls her eyes. Don't be daft. Your parents might take you back if you only act like a good girl. And ain't you sorry anyway for what you done to me? Here's your chance to make it up. But what about you? They've already got a hired girl. Oh, you'd like that, wouldn't you? Letitia shakes her head. No, I won't be your maid, but you'll be 21 before long, and you can come back for me then. By then, Engstrom will have fixed my teeth, and I'll look respectable like those on Ward 1. That's 3 more years, Amy says. Longer. Letitia shrugs. Engstrom will look after me. The old doctor. I can manage him. Letitia's face is flushed with exertion. Will you write a letter or not? Amy ducks her head, watching their feet. If she did convince her parents to take her back, where else might they send her in 3 years' time? What might they expect her to do or be? Her feet lose the music. Letitia pushes her away, and when Amy looks up, the mustached young doctor has come, as if summoned by the mention of his name. Letitia holds out her arms to him, but he shakes his head. The next song. His voice is crisp, commanding. I haven't danced with your friend, Miss Underwood. Amy steps backward into moving bodies, into oaths and glares from the other dancers. Her hands sweat awful, says Letitia. Only feel mine. The next song, Engstrom repeats, smiling. He steadies Amy's elbow, as though she were stumbling, not fleeing. Just look at me. You'll be fine. It is an order as much as an invitation. He begins to steer before Amy can wrest her hand from his. Letitia is alone at the edge of the room, and then Amy cannot say where her friend has gone. Engstrom leads skillfully, executing tidy turns and somehow finding room to make long, gliding passes across the dance floor. Dancing with him is like ice skating with her father. Engstrom moves with the same speed and decisiveness. Amy's feet follow his easily, but she sweats more than she ever has, dancing with Letitia. How do you like the hospital? Dr. Engstrom asks. You've been here almost 6 months, I think. She tries to count. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. If they brought her here in September, then he's right. You're very young, aren't you, Miss Underwood? How was it before? Will you tell me about life back home? She shakes her head, wiggles her fingers in his grip, but his hand is on her waist and he continues to move. We don't often see patients your age. Had you been ill, Miss Underwood? Suffered some kind of accident or shock? He doesn't take his dark eyes from hers. What brought you here? Letitia says you're going to buy her new teeth, she blurts. Her face grows hotter. Engstrom nods, unperturbed. It's appalling that patients are still mistreated in this day and age. Force feeding is not used here, nor any other methods of physical coercion. The music swells and Engstrom sweeps them along. Keep looking at me, Miss Underwood, not at your feet. Did you learn to dance at home? Over Engstrom's shoulder, Amy sees Letitia paired with a fat man in town clothes. He's the very same pink-faced man that grabbed her at the December dance. Has he been lurking all this time in the chapel? Nausea shakes her. There are plenty of places to hide, in the front row during the evening program, at the back of the room during Sunday services, and she sees the fat man nod to the old doctor when they pass. The old doctor's wife smiles and bats her china doll eyes, but the doctor himself scowls. Catching sight of Amy, he stares after her and Engstrom. That old doctor is a liar, Amy says. Let him hear. That old doctor is a thief. Engstrom grimaces. He lays a finger briefly against his own lips. The doctor is well-intentioned, he says. Can you tell me why you don't like him? She closes her eyes, following the music. The tempo now surges, now falters. When she opens her eyes, Engstrom is waiting. His clean, smooth face is not a lumberjack's, but like that bearded man by the lake, he grips her waist and won't let go. Where could she possibly run if he did? Letitia, she whispers, he's used her poorly. Engstrom raises his eyebrows. She's told you this? Or you've observed something? Think carefully. Amy shakes her head. Whatever his faults, a doctor can commit no greater crime than to mistreat his patients. Do you truly think our superintendent has done this? She shakes her head again. I don't know. Well, I could not believe such a thing, not without proof. He leans toward her, smelling of lemon and cedar. Miss Underwood, you must know by now that there are women here who tell falsehoods. They do not always mean to, and if they didn't, if they gave up their storytelling, perhaps they might recover and leave. You would help your friend a great deal by not encouraging her stories. Do you have any complaints of your own? It's not a story. Engstrom sighs. Miss Underwood, wouldn't you rather be at home? Shut up in that house. The trees all gone. Amy shakes her head again, feels the dull weight of a headache. If he would only let her go. Instead, Engstrom smiles. You're a fine dancer and a fine friend to Miss Olson, who has suffered greatly. But what is it that keeps you here, Miss Underwood? Do the doctors speak to you regularly? The old man comes to her with his bag of instruments and asks her questions that she will not answer. She will not tell him or Dr. Meyer about her periods or her stools, or worse yet, her thoughts. No, she says, we do not speak at all. Engstrom gazes over her head. Perhaps you didn't know, Miss Underwood, that the doctors measure your improvement by your cooperation, your ability and willingness to interact with the hospital's staff and with other patients. Do you understand? I think you are more improved than your doctors see. Surely you do not want to remain here another 6 months. Amy pulls away from him. The song is nearly over. Letitia is ready to claim her turn, but Engstrom still holds her hand. Once more, Miss Underwood? His dark eyes hold her too. We haven't finished our conversation. Oh no, Letitia interjects. Look at how you fatigued the child already. Did you see how I made my partner move? She takes Engstrom's free hand and traces dance steps. And this one's a polka. Let's go. If you'll excuse me, Engstrom says, bowing to Amy. He and Letitia leap into the set, joining the other prancing couples. Laughing, Letitia throws back her head, exposing her terrible teeth. And Engstrom laughs too. At Amy? A hand on her elbow makes her jump, but it's just Lil. Step to the side, miss. You'll get run over standing there. How often do we have these? Amy's stomach turns with the spinning room. Lil shrugs. Every month or so, sometimes oftener. Did you find a beau? Amy lets Lil guide her to a chair. He's Letitia's beau. That Engstrom? Lil shakes her head. I can't abide a dandy. On the dance floor, Engstrom holds Letitia closer than he'd held Amy, their whole fronts touching. Amy turns to Lil instead. What happened to those girls from your albums? They're all married now. Lil smiles, all except old Lil. Do they remember you, like they said? Well, Lil bends to straighten Amy's skirt, the new wool dress from her Christmas box. Well, I've been here and there since those days, not like the rest of them, but I dare say they remembered me for a while anyway. I won't ever marry. No? Lil dabs Amy's forehead with a handkerchief. I've heard of those who are happy with their men, but I can't say I envy most. How warm you feel, Miss Underwood. Sit tight and I'll get you some punch. Amy nods and loosens her collar. If she could lie down, her head would feel better, but then Lil might scold her or send her upstairs. And if she's upright, she can watch the young doctor, the old doctor. Maybe Lil will sit with her for a while and tell her more stories about her girlhood and the kinds of friends who copied poems for one another. But though Amy sits still, the dancing dizzies her. The men, the women, the young doctor, bodies clutched together, revolving. Her heart races and her head feels as Letitia's must sometimes, like a cage holding a wild creature. The creature lunges, raking its claws down the inside of her skull. She pushes it back, but it's too fierce. It is everywhere inside her, surging through her chest, racing up her throat. Her jaw spasms, a hot red mess splashes onto her knees. Miss, cries Lil as she hurries back. Amy's throat and nose burn, her eyes stream, and now the doctor will come, the old one or the young one or the stout one or the lame one. There's no getting away from them here. And her mouth opens again in a torment of vomit. Red from the dyes of icing and punch, red as though disease were rotting her insides. Her chest heaves too fast, and Letitia is still dancing. Someone's hand soothes her forehead. A cloth is passed over her fouled lips. Someone is lifting her into an old woman's wheeled chair. Rattling from the room, she presses her palms to her eye sockets to steady her head against the jolting motion. Her body sways with unfamiliar turns, and when she takes her hands from her eyes, she's arrived somewhere new, a clean white dormitory. The chair and the attendant who brought her are gone already, and she won't find her way back to the chapel. No breadcrumb trail, no brother by her side. Her father is a woodcutter and her stepmother wicked, but the women in this strange room are not witches. They are plump white hens who cluck as they sponge her face clean, remove her soiled dress. They draw a clean white gown over her head, settle her between white sheets with a thermometer beneath her tongue. Don't bite, the hens say, and after the effort not to, her teeth chatter uncontrollably when the instrument is removed. The nurses bring her thick drinks, lay cool wings against her brow, hold her upright over the basin when she vomits again. They place chips of ice in her hot mouth. The nurses roost around her watching until at last the ward's whiteness overcomes her and the sweet smell of feathers floats her away. And I'll end there. Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for questions and answers if there happen to be any. Happy to take them.
Did you base Amy's character on case studies that you researched?
Yeah, to some extent. I thought, that diagnosis of pubescent insanity was really intriguing to me and seemed, kind of broad and kind of like a catch-all. So that was the germ of the character. And then in the early days, her distress over the fact that her father worked for the lumber company was much more acute, and the cutting down of the forests was, a thing that bothered her much more in early drafts than in the final draft, although it's still part of it. She still has this strong attachment to trees and to the forest, and a sense of kinship, I think, with trees. That's, a little bit of what's at issue too.
Well, what kind of research did you do for this kind of things?
Yeah, well, as I pointed out a couple of slides ago, reading primary text from the era was very important. So Kirkbride's book about the construction and organization of this kind of hospital, that was kind of core. The American Journal of Insanity and other medical texts. There's a lot more material that's accessible on the physician side of things than on the patient side. Records are sealed, of course, from hospitals like this. And when you find, say, like an anthology of voices from inside 19th century mental hospitals, that's been gleaned maybe from letters home and things like that. So those do exist, but those voices are much harder to access directly than the voices of doctors. So there was a lot of imagining my way into the gaps. And then, of course, to think about what day-to-day life was like in this period. I mean, I would feel fairly confident that I knew how, thing X worked, and then realize, maybe you better Google that and discover that, oh, of course, that thing worked completely differently in 1889 than it does now. So there's a lot of fiddly details that I wanted to get right, not because I felt as though that exactitude was necessary maybe to the reader, but because I wanted to have the constraints of the material world around the characters be real and pressing, and really think about what it would be like to live in this material culture, in these clothes, in this, everything about this time. So, yes.
Wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I need this sign.
I'm happy to do it.
You have a relative or two. The one was a nurse and the other was different, but you never met her.
My grandmother, oh, for sure, I did.
Oh gosh, because I'm looking back now, did she have stories? Bad stories? Was she traumatized by experiencing that?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know whether any of my relatives who are here might have answers or not. I don't remember grandma ever. I didn't actually realize that her training had been at a school in the state hospital until it was too late to ask questions about that. So I'm not sure the answer to that question. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a really wonderful book about the nurses training school at the state hospital that compiles a lot of people's accounts of their time there, from there's an effort, I think, to profile a woman from each of the graduating classes. It began, I believe, in 1908, and it ended maybe in the 50s, maybe a little bit earlier than that. Not remembering the title, but if you were to Google it, you would find it. And those women relate some anecdotes about what it was like to go through the program and to work with the patients. So it's a great source. Oh, in the front row.
Stephanie, thanks for your presentation. My question is actually going back to something you said, I think, at the beginning, which was you were intrigued by why this hospital is here in this particular place. And do you have more answers to that now?
So the question, I'm sorry, I know I'm supposed to repeat questions, so I will repeat this one. The question is about, do you have any further insights into why the hospital is here? That was a question at the beginning. And did I learn anything or realize anything in the course of writing about it? Well, first of all, there's a very extensive bidding process to figure out, who would get the contract and where this hospital would be built. It was going to be built in northern Michigan, but where, that was up for grabs. And so I think the package that the civic leaders of Traverse City put together was pretty compelling, and they had a brickyard nearby. I forget precisely where the brickyard is, where all those yellow bricks come from, but it's somebody said it's where the Pathfinder School is. Okay, so Markham Brickyard. Okay, so ready access to bricks, good drainage. I mean, the site, I think, had a lot of advantages. So, you know, that's why it is here in particular. But why it was built according to the Kirkbride plan, I never really felt like I understood the answer to that question, except for that the other hospitals in Michigan were. And the one that was built subsequent to Traverse City, at least one, maybe two, were as well. So I think there's maybe a commitment to this particular style of architecture, but definitely it was a thing, you know, the profession's commitment to the Kirkbride plan had wavered by that time. And there were certainly there was a big camp of people who felt like another homier model would be better suited to patient care. So. Anyone else?
Question about a slide, 2 or 3 slides back, where the women were sitting in a. Yes, what's that object on the extreme right there? Is that a stove?
I'm not sure. I think it might be. I think it might be a stove with, or a fireplace with some kind of guard on it. Because this looks like. Is that the extent of the question? Okay, thank you. And this is a receiving ward, I think is the full caption. The photos I'm using as reproduced in Angels in the Architecture. They came from the Historical Society. Heidi Johnson sourced them from the Historical Society. And almost all of them are dated circa 1890, which makes me think that maybe there was a day or period when they'd hired a professional photographer to come through and take a batch of photos. They all seem to be roughly of the same vintage. Anybody else? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I've heard that the style of the hospital changed when it became more important for them to take medicine than it was to do the holiest.
Did you go through that?
Yeah, so the question is about how things shifted when when pharmaceutical interventions became kind of more widely used. And this is a period sort of like outside of the scope of my expertise, such as it is, but I think you're right that when people were often kind of over-medicated, you know, once more pharmaceutical treatments, pharmacological treatments became available in these facilities. But again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of my own expertise, such as it is. So, yes.
I'm really interested in kind of the reply, you know, apologizing of womanhood and girlhood, and that these diagnoses were maybe a bit trumped up. What were the men typically in these facilities?
Yeah, so the question is about the diagnoses on the male side of the hall. And, you know, some of those also sound a little peculiar to modern ears. There's a lot of, on both sides of the hall, a lot of overwork, a lot of grief and shock and anxiety, you know, trauma, basically. I think a lot of people on both sides of, you know, on both wings had suffered brain injuries of one sort or another that hadn't been properly addressed. And then I read a statistic, actually, it's Nancy Tomes, who's a really brilliant scholar of 19th century mental health and has a monograph of her own about Kirkbride, and also wrote the introduction for, I'm going to plug Angels in the Architecture one more time by the late Heidi Johnson. But in her introduction, she refers to a statistic that I could not find the source for. She says it's courtesy of Gerald Grobe, who's also a historian of the history of psychology. He estimates, according to Nancy Tomes, again, I can't track down where she got this citation from Grobe, but it's fascinating if it's true. He estimates that up to 30% of people in 19th century mental hospitals had syphilis. So, you know, syphilis leads to mental illness if untreated, and it there wasn't an effective treatment for it. So I would imagine, although I guess I shouldn't assume, that more of the men might have had that than the women, but it's probably pretty widespread across both arms of the hospital. Yeah.
Been working on this since 2001, and I'm curious about the stages of the project.
Yeah, so the stages of the project. So this is a book that I finished long before it was published. And, that's sort of some choices that I made about an opportunity I had to publish it earlier that I passed over because an agent kind of suggested that she might be able to get me a pretty killer deal for it, and that didn't, some of it is my own choices. So it was kind of like in the drawer off and on for about a decade until the Central Michigan opportunity opened up. And so the Summit Series prize was looking for fiction by Michigan authors or about Michigan, or, with some Michigan tie, and it could have been pretty loose. And I thought, well, this book is about Michigan. I'm from Michigan. I still live in Michigan. So, and I did have a feeling when I sent it in, if it doesn't win this one, then I'm done. And so I was really thrilled that it did, and it's been a great experience. And, again, the novel's been completed for some time, but it's something I've gone back to and revised and reworked and reconsidered in the intervening years. But I've written a couple other books, since I kind of put this one in its final, in close to what it's wound up being its final form. It's a book it's been with me for a long time, but the research itself did take about 10 years, the research and writing. So it was a iterative process. I would sort of write a little bit and then either start working on something else, on short stories, and kind of not, hit a roadblock and not quite know what to do next, or have a research question I didn't know the answer to, and so I'd need to dive into that for a while before I could move forward. Yeah.
You live in Traverse City?
Yeah, do I think my interest in this was because I live in, oh, absolutely. Yeah, this place was always,
Place to hang
it
out.
sure was. It sure was a teenage place to hang out. I never got inside, but I know plenty of people who did. So, yeah, definitely. I didn't take prom pictures, but I get it. I get it. And then, yeah, in the back.
In the back, for most of your research.
What surprised me the most in my research? I didn't know anything about the early days, so all of that was surprising and eye-opening. I think most novels that I had read about psychiatric hospitals were in the vein of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Girl Interrupted. Oh, I'm sorry. I'd read a lot of things that sort of looked at hospitals like this much later on. Can you hear me now? Okay. In the 20th, mid 20th century, kind of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest types of stories. So I was really interested in thinking about what it had been like in its early years, what the ideas had been behind it. I was surprised that they're fairly progressive ideas, and I wanted to understand that more.
And Dr. Ingram's experimentation with medicine is in your book or referenced from a different book?
Yeah, so I got that pretty closely from the American Journal of Insanity, from an article that a doctor had written about his own self trials with that drug. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Of that, his study in your book?
Not really, no. I mean, he and the doctor do have a confrontation about it eventually, and he explains to the doctor how he managed to do this, and so a little bit more about it comes out, but we don't see him doing it or anything like that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did your grandmother spend all of her time at the hospital, or was that the psychiatric part of it?
Did my grandmother spend all of her time at the hospital? Neglecting her children, such as yourself? I've heard that that's the case, yeah, that it was a very demanding position. And there she is again, Grandma Iris. Yes, she was a very dedicated nurse from what I understand.
Besides the state hospital for training. Wasn't she?
Um, I defer to those who might have the answer. No, I think she graduated from the State Hospital Training School in 1933.
Psychiatric, and that's why she was there.
It was a regular nursing program. Yeah, it just happened to be housed at the state hospital. So they did do some rotations on the wards at the state hospital, but they also went elsewhere for clinicals. So
Your grandpa?
it would seem so.
Oh,
All right. Anybody else? Yes, Kelly.
What are you currently reading?
What am I currently reading? Oh, I am reading a novel called Tandem by Andy Mosina, who I was just in conversation with at BookBug, and this is a bookstore in Kalamazoo. So that's a recent novel about a college professor in Kalamazoo who gets into a hit and run accident. And after that, I'm looking forward to reading Rachel Kushner's Creation Lake. Kushner is one of my favorite authors. Anybody on Zoom? Okay. One more. Yes, Ms. Hay.
You see yourself continuing in the genre of historical fiction of mental health care, or going into another avenue?
Well, I do have another book completed that's a collection of 2 short novels, and they're historical in nature, but they're not about mental health. They're set in the mid-19th century in New England, and they're both about women artists and sort of different models of women's empowerment in that era. So one of them is set partially in a Shaker community in the mid-19th century, and one of them is about a woman who was a student of transcendentalist Margaret Fuller, who died that's sort of the inciting incident of that particular book. So I have worked in a historical mode subsequent to this project, and I probably will again. The piece I'm writing right now is speculative, and it's post-apocalyptic, and it's set in the future, and it's kind of different from what I'm doing here. So yeah, thank you. All right. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. I appreciate it very much.